I'm speaking today from the University of California, Los Angeles, which is a land-grant institution. This means that it resides on land that is provided by the state that was historically the homeland of indigenous peoples. Accordingly, I want to begin this presentation by acknowledging my presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples, and to pay my respects to their ancestors, elders, and relatives, past, present, and emerging. This land acknowledgement is an important acknowledgement by my own institution of its complicity in a legacy of massive systematic dispossession and genocide, an existential crisis for the indigenous peoples of these lands that continues to be perpetuated today through almost every facet of Californian life. Indeed, few of us who are here today at the conference are located in places that do not have difficult pasts and contested histories, resulting from, among other things, conquest, colonization, settlement, nationalism, mercantilism, and industrialization. Such activities simultaneously underpin the human forces that have precipitated so many of the crises of today, including ethnic and racial conflict, mass displacement, environmental change, and global health emergencies. I start with this emphasis because many of our cultural and memory institutions, like our educational institutions, share in this complicity. Their missions and practices, the narratives they project, and the audiences they prioritize are born out of and embedded in these histories and infrastructures that have precipitated so many human-made crises. And their values are built into their institutional locations, architectures, and practices. Among these cultural and memory institutions, archives have often not only been the reflections and the documenters of these precipitating forces, but also integral players in the bureaucratic infrastructures and grand narratives that promulgate them. So what does such a sweeping indictment have to do with the theme of this conference, heritage protection under conditions of crisis? Certainly, archives, like other heritage institutions, are themselves victims of both natural and man-made crises. They have sustained damage and losses from earthquakes and hurricanes. They have increasingly become deliberate targets of inter-ethnic and international conflict because of their cultural and juridical roles and symbolism, as well as because of the spaces on which they're located. And as everyone attending this conference is no doubt painfully aware, archives, like other heritage institutions and indeed the entire globe, have been systematically affected by the current COVID-19 pandemic. Many archives also suffer from chronic lack of resources and official neglect, or the opposite, political interference, which limits their ability to respond to crises. Nevertheless, archives and the records they contain remain powerful instruments of official and personal memory and accountability. For as long as archives are seen and see themselves primarily to be about the past, as passive recipients of official records and stewards of historical research materials, archives remain instruments of the forces I mentioned earlier. I intend today, therefore, to try to short-circuit that thinking and take a different approach to considering archives, not so much in terms of how they themselves are affected in times of crisis, but in terms of their obligations, their ethical obligations to rethink practices and priorities and consider what they can actively contribute to anticipating and responding to crises, taking advantage of opportunities that emerging digital applications and digital collections present for reshaping practices and priorities, and doing things that could never have been possible in purely manual practice. This argument builds on a discussion that has been ongoing in the archival field over the past decade about the role of archives and record-keeping institutions and professional expertise in addressing the global and regional grand challenges that often sit at the heart of today's crises. The title of my presentation, Capturing, Preserving, Extracting and Applying Archival Knowledge in Times of Crisis, gestures to a continuum of proactive archival activities that the examples I will provide, very brief examples, that they will suggest. When I speak here of archival knowledge, I mean two things. First, I mean knowledge relevant to impending, ongoing, and unanticipated crises that is explicit or latent in and could be extracted from what is documented, acquired, and preserved by archives. And secondly, I mean the distinctive professional and technical expertise of archivists as it relates to records and record keeping, and how that expertise could be activated in support of those most affected by crises in and over time and space. Some such activities may already be familiar to you. For example, national archives such as Finland have stepped up to temporarily hold digital copies of official records from archives in war-torn countries. Or the work of the Syrian Archive, a Syrian-led project that aims to preserve, capture, preserve, enhance, and memorialize digitally witnessed documentation of human rights violations and other crimes committed in the conflict in Syria, so that this documentation can be used in advocacy, justice, and accountability. I'm going to introduce briefly just 3 American examples that are addressing crises posed by climate change, mass displacement and migration, and the COVID-19 pandemic. My intent here is to illustrate how archival knowledge, if applied with expanded priorities and conceptualization, is in fact deeply relevant to the crises we face as societies and as a world, not only in understanding what can be learned from the past, but also in responding meaningfully to present crises and preparing societies, institutions, and individuals to cope with inevitable future crises. Around the world, Indigenous communities are working with archivists and technology developers to find creative and culturally appropriate ways to use new technologies to document or recover lost or disappearing land, language, practices, and knowledge. Some of you might be familiar, for example, with the Wunungu Awara Animating Indigenous Knowledges project based at Monash University in Melbourne that is preserving language and supporting intergenerational learning and knowledge sharing through producing astonishing 3D animations in partnership with Australian Indigenous communities, groups, and organizations that tell their stories. I wanted to mention another example of how archival and technological expertise are being brought together proactively to address the cultural impact and loss of Indigenous knowledge and lifeways that are anticipated if global warming continues on its current trajectory and sea levels continue to rise. Low-lying islands in the world's oceans are susceptible to being completely submerged, resulting in a literal obliteration of homelands for the people who live there, many of them Indigenous nations. Anticipating this, the Indigenous Futures Program at the University of Minnesota is working participatively with diasporic Micronesian community members, both to capture and to teach traditional navigation knowledge based on spaces and practices that may no longer continue to exist, and using haptic 3D virtual reality technology. Let me turn now for my other 2 examples to collaborative research in which we're currently engaged in the Department of Information Studies at UCLA. The Refugee Rights in Records, or R3 initiative, is a collaboration of several years between UCLA, the City of University of New York, and the University of Liverpool. This research recognizes that bureaucratic records, as well as personal and community archives, are all fundamental to how refugees and others who have been displaced by a range of global and regional crises are able to exercise their human rights as well as their ability to thrive. These people are increasingly finding that records and record keeping have been weaponized to prevent them actualizing and attaining their human rights. Moreover, they are among the least enabled to carry create, preserve, and access records of their own culture, lives, and experiences. At the same time, technological implementations, both by governments, also NGOs, and by those who've been displaced themselves, have been game changers. Today, a cluster of R3 projects address several objectives, including those that are on this screen. I wanted to highlight two in particular for this talk: identifying ways in which archival professionals and institutions might contribute to and collaborate on locating, protecting, preserving, validating, providing access to, translating, and certifying the kinds of records that are needed by people who've been displaced, and also in developing both educational and technological interventions that would support refugees in understanding record-keeping requirements and in carrying, locating, securing, and preserving reliable copies of their own documentation. One of our projects that relates directly to these 2 points is a collaboration with the Rohingya Project, a grassroots initiative for financial and social inclusion of stateless Rohingya worldwide. Rohingya refugees are often living in dire conditions. One challenge they face is proving their historical presence and land ownership in Myanmar or Burma, from whence they were forced to flee as a result of persecution and massacres, and where they are not permitted to hold citizenship. Through a partnership with Propi, a blockchain real estate solution provider, we are currently developing a pilot archive that allows for Rohingya community members in diaspora to bring any surviving documentation that they still hold to a community center where both a lawyer and a community elder provide attestations to the validity of these documents. These documents are then digitized, and the attestations, and entered onto a blockchain that was originally designed to transmit materials securely relating to property and land transactions across geography and legal jurisdictions. The goals are both to build trusted evidence of long-term presence and property in Myanmar, as well as to see whether such a solution can be extended into a trusted digital community archive that refugees can use to preserve and transmit other forms of documentation in ways that cannot be hacked into or tampered with by hostile parties. Just as longitudinal climate data has been essential for research on climate change, knowledge contained in existing archival holdings is integral to understanding how crises historically developed and were addressed or managed. This is increasingly being referred to as big data of the past. This importance of collating and mining the knowledge contained in archives has been significantly recognized in the multi-million euro EU Time Machine project, which states that digitization is only the first step of a long series of extraction processes. Such computational models are key resources for developing new critical reflections on our past and future, enabling new insights for historians, social scientists, creative arts professionals, policymakers, and for the general public, with a significant common denominator, contributing to informed decision-making from everyday life to academic, professional, and political matters. Such endeavors to extract and find meaningful patterns from archival content become even more important in moments of crisis because of the insights they can provide from prior experiences. The push to find and analyze historical data about the 1918 to 1920 Spanish flu pandemic in order to identify whether there was any knowledge potentially relevant to the current COVID-19 pandemic would be a particularly salient example. Indeed, recognizing this, a declaration was issued in 2020 by the International Council on Archives on archivists' duty to document the current pandemic for future reference. At the same time, however, our ability to recover and extract knowledge about prior or even current crises from archives is tightly related to and limited by how much the scope and handling of those archives anticipated such kinds of uses. So in my final example, I want to mention just very briefly is another research project that I'm currently engaged in that reconsiders archival documentary appraisal and metadata practices, as well as predictive algorithmic design from the perspective of anticipating, extracting, and applying archival knowledge in unfolding and future crises. This research brings together ideas drawn from both the emerging area of computational archival science with digital humanities techniques. It both illustrates this potential while also illustrating how multiple crises can be imbricated. In this case, the pandemic has demonstrated and has fed growing racist sentiment in the United States, specifically anti-Asian racism. And in fact, our research, which began to be published last June, anticipated very strongly and demonstrated anti-Asian sentiment that is only now starting to make the news in the United States. Social media have been selectively archived as documentation relevant to societal trends and national contributions by state libraries, by government archives, and by academic special collections for almost 2 decades. This particular study sought to develop proof of concept of automatic methods adapted from digital humanities that could be used to enrich as well as speed up the description and potentially appraisal of archive social media collections. We used a test collection of almost 3.5 million unique English language tweets relating to COVID-19, China, and Chinese people, seeking to identify incidences of hate speech, as well as hard to pinpoint trends in anti-Chinese racist sentiment. And as I said, we were able to identify those trends many months ahead of where it is now hitting the media. So what I have described today is certainly an ambitious and activist agenda. I just wanted to leave you with a few takeaways. Supporting accountability and historical scholarship are essential archival activities, but archival knowledge and expertise really ethically should also support and prioritize human and humanitarian needs. Archives must expect that there will be crises that require quick activation of archival knowledge and orient their practices accordingly. Crises don't know national borders, neither do human activities. To respond, archives and archivists have to think and act beyond their national focus without losing sight of local needs. Archivists need to be engaged in records creation and policy development, as well as preservation and access, participatively working with those who are most affected by loss or inaccessibility or disadvantaged by documentation and bureaucratic record keeping. And finally, digital technologies offer new ways to do this, while also helping archives address their own internal crises. So I want to thank you for listening to me. We do have some references that if anybody is interested in having a look at these recent publications, I'm happy to send them to them. Thank you.